Today's video is all about atmospheric perspective and mixing the color green in its many forms. Creating depth and distance within our landscape paintings is one of the most challenging things to do. And while we should never paint by formulas, there are a few simple tips that I keep in mind to make this much easier. Today, I'm going to be sharing some of those top tips about atmospheric perspective in green from a recent Patreon tutorial. The full tutorial is on the Patreon, over an hour long, full process, everything drawing, and tons of other planner tutorials. That being said, now to the good stuff. So I want to set up some of the darks of these trees in the foreground. So right now I took a bit of ivory black, cad yellow, and ultramarine blue. So the way I'm mixing these greens is I've got 3 yellows and 3 blues. I've got a greenish yellow and a reddish yellow. I've got a reddish blue and a true blue and an actual bluish green, which kind of counts sometimes, but I try to avoid using Viridian for my greens. And then ivory black is a neutral. My neutral yellow is my yellow ochre. When we want to make a green for the foreground, what we need to rely on is having more yellow in the foreground in that mixture. And so we've been consistently in sort of an ambient shadow. So I'm drawing in this one tree, and then I'll also draw in some of its shadow. That's a way to think about the large masses, but then another way to think about smaller masses, and specifically shadows, is the shadows are the most strongly affected by atmosphere. So then I'll take a little bit of burnt sienna to darken this mixture, and it'll be my burnt sienna that I'm going to go in and I'm going to draw in some elements of this tree right now. Now I'm going to have a scale of having something in the foreground to understand just how far away these distant mountains are. And so now I'm going to work in between the sky and my foreground element. When we're working with atmospheric perspective, we need to think about the triangulation of our color values. Triangulation is one of the best ways to relate everything throughout the painting. So when I have my extremes keyed, so I have my sky, which is largely my lightest light, and I have a dark in the foreground, what is happening in this painting is now I have some of my relationships established, of my highest relationship and my lowest relationship in my values. And now what I want is I want to find the way that these relate. So I want to find the way that this furthest mountain relates in between the sky and in between the tree. And I see that it's very, very close to the sky, but it's a little bit darker. And then I want to find the next plane in the distance. And I see that it's still a little bit darker than that, but it still relates closer to the sky. And then I find my middle ground. So it's not the first foreground or the second ground, but the plane that's in the middle, these distant trees that are sloping here. When I squint down at that, I see, okay, well, that is a little bit leaning more closer towards these trees, but those shadows are still bluer and lighter than these trees as a whole. There's an expression that yellow drops off at the nose. One of the ways to think about atmospheric perspective is that the further we see in the distance, the less yellow we're seeing. So one way to think about mixing our greens is the greens in the foreground will have the most cadmium yellow lemon. And then in the midground, as they move towards the midground, they'll have a little bit more cadmium yellow medium. And as they move further back, they have less of the pure yellow and more of the orangish yellow that is really neutralizing. So now I think I have decent color, and I'm going to continue painting these darks. Now, the clouds are moving a little bit with these trees, but there's still a lot of these trees that are in shadow. And so now I can take the same brush and mix for a lot of ultramarine blue and some of my yellow ochre, and just make sure that it's evenly spaced. So when I put it down with this green, and I see that it is just a little bit lighter. I think it's getting a little bit too dark in value when I compare it to this plane in the distance. So I'm going to ever so slightly darken it. So I'm working on trying to mask things in a little bit better. And maybe it doesn't look blue enough. So I'll take a little bit of ultramarine and also a little bit of my cad orange, because it looks like it could be a little bit purpler for some of these darks that are getting really close to these greens. I'm going to start mixing some ultramarine blue, and this is a little bit of a green brush, and mostly a tiny touch of cad yellow medium. And I'll also go for a little bit of ivory black, because they're a little bit darker, but ivory black with cad yellow really does the trick. Yellow out of the tube is a color that is very light in value. Yellow, as it's most colorful, it's fairly light in value. Blue is much darker. So one of the ways to control for whether a green appears to be in the lights or within the darks is by how much yellow do we have in there compared to blue. And for all intents and purposes, for this, the ivory black is somewhat of a blue. And here, this dark green is a little bit darker than the atmosphere in the distance. So I'm gonna work that in. And now that creates the final depth. Now there's a really dark tree over there in the distance. So a little bit of ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, mix my generic dark, mix that a little bit with the greens. And so here, when trees start to get close, we can start paying attention to each individual tree. Okay, this tree will be good. It would be good to offset some of these trees in the foreground. And I'm just going to scrub in, well, I guess make it a little bit lighter in value with some yellow ochre and some cad yellow. So by just adding a tiny bit of yellow into my mixture, that is going to be a good mixture for the upright planes. And even though those lights are technically green, we need to forget about how green they are. The greenness of the grass is its local color, and for us as painters, it's actually irrelevant. What's relevant to us is the global color, which means whatever that object is out there, plus light and shadow, plus any of the atmosphere coming and separating us and the object, plus the actual effects that can happen within our own eye. So even though a tree way off in the distance, such as the mountains in the far off distance, we know that there are a bunch of trees there. But for us as painters, we need to forget that those trees are green, and we need to focus on the atmosphere and on the light and what we actually see. And now what about in the very distance? So one thing I'm noticing is this tree has some deep shadows in the middle, and then there are a bunch of other trees that are being cut off. And so I want these trees to be pretty small, and I want to indicate their smaller size. Okay, and there's another small one there, and there's another small one right in here. Okay, so here, not only do the lights of the greens have more yellow, but the shadows are warmer. They're deeper in a way. Okay, and there's still some bushes in here. And we're getting just a little bit of light on these trees in the midground. So what I'll do, I'll reach for a bunch of yellow ochre and also some of this cobalt blue. I'll mix a slightly darker light mixture. One of the things that's happening in the landscape at all times is the theory of planes and angles. And so what that is whether something faces the sun, it's very similar to the form principle. So you have a sphere and the form affects the value. In the landscape, you have some large forms and you have some large planes that can be simplified as masses. And so these large masses that we see are the flat planes, which are so flat ground that faces the sky, upright planes, which are trees because they basically get averaged out. All the little branches, when you see them further away, they're basically all upright. And then we also have hills or mountainous ranges. And so those hills usually tend to be in between the upright and the flat planes in value. And we see that on a micro level within some of the flat planes in the foreground are really light. And then some of the slanting planes, which are not the upright planes, but within this little hill, we see some of that. And so now by doing a bunch of little taps, you can sort of capture a little bit more of the feeling of some of the lights here. But then we'll reach for some pure blue, some pure ultramarine. Whoop, we can see that pure ultramarine is way too dark. And then the rest here appears to be pretty flat. Now, what about this rock in my foreground? Well, rocks are usually pretty gray. So if I take some burnt sienna and some white and some green of my palette and I mix in a little bit of ultramarine blue, I can start getting a color that closely resembles this rock. And then I see that it actually gets a little bit darker. So some burnt sienna, just for a second. All right, so this idea of bracketing, I think I didn't get around to it earlier, but this idea of bracketing your atmospheric perspective when it comes to landscape painting between foreground, middle ground, background, it has to do with values and it has to do with contrast. And so basically in the background, you have the least amount of contrast. And so you have the least values. And so everything is painted in a very narrow contrast. And then in the foreground, you have the most amount of contrast between your lights and your shadows, and you have the greatest range of contrast right in here. But then in the middle, we constantly have zones that we are working in between, catching the bits that are a little bit darker and the bits that are a little bit lighter. Establishing this range of contrast initially, when I created my sky and I created my darkest dark, and then I filled this in, now that lets me go back in and a little bit more carefully play around with these edges. And so maybe there are certain areas where I need to push just a little bit darker, and maybe there are some areas which need to be pushed a little bit lighter. Initially, this was flat. I had to lighten this up. Now I'm darkening this up. Sometimes yellow ochre and viridian create a really nice golden green. So with the yellow ochre and viridian, and maybe just a touch of ivory, just to keep it dark, I can go back in and restate this tree. And actually, I think it would be a good moment to restate the tree all the way down. So this brush is kind of old and beat up, and it's making some really nice marks that I like. But I think that green, as I'm putting it down, I notice that it's actually not rich enough. Here, what I'm doing right now is I'm lightening the trees that are furthest away. So they're at the bottom of this slope. They are further and further away from the viewer. So it's also another good excuse why they could be lowered and pushed back by some of my cad yellow medium and some of my cad orange. And then here we could soften this edge and create the sensation of maybe some bushes. But this was a pretty good video. It showed a bunch of things. It showed sky, so atmospheric perspective in the sky, in the clouds, but also in a very distant panorama. So what was important is to remember that yellow drops off at the nose, and also shadows are warmest in the foreground. And the most yellow you get within your green mixtures is also in the lights of the greens. To mix green mixtures in shadow, you also need to add in a little bit less of that yellow, because that yellow out of the tube is a very bright color. And on my palette, I've got 3 yellows, my cadmium yellows and my yellow ochre. So a warm and a cool and an earth, and then 3 blues and arguably a bluish green. Sometimes we need it, but really I touch that very sparingly. The one time I did touch it, it actually wasn't helpful. It was even almost hurtful. So I hope you guys enjoyed that video. As again, the full over hour-long tutorial is on the Patreon. You can see the entire painting start to finish, drawing, texture, blocking, stage, all the good stuff, and many more tutorials just on plein air painting, painting outside with oils. That was it. Thanks for watching, and until next time.